Judge Anthony Trenga walked into that hearing thinking he could rattle a freshman congresswoman with a few sharp questions, but what happened next left the entire courtroom stunned into silence. Nobody warned her how hostile it would feel the moment she stepped into that room. The air inside the federal courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia wasn't thick with silence. It was loaded, tense, watchful, as if the people in those seats were waiting to see how quickly she'd crack. Jasmine Crockett stood tall anyway. Her dark gray blazer was sharp, her natural curls pulled back neatly, her expression unreadable. She had been in rooms like this before, as a public defender, as a civil rights attorney, as a woman who knew she would never be handed the benefit of the doubt. Still, this hearing felt different. The House Oversight Committee had called her in to answer questions surrounding alleged partisan conflicts in a recent investigation. Most of it was politics, grandstanding, optics. But one figure stood out from the rest. Judge Anthony Trenga, 68 years old, known for cutting through noise like a blade. No patience for speeches, no tolerance for anyone he thought was playing the system. He didn't look at her when she sat at the witness table. He looked through her. Jasmine felt it instantly. This wasn't going to be a back and forth. It was going to be a test. And Trenga intended to fail her publicly. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, voice flat as concrete. "Let's skip the niceties. Please limit your responses to facts, not campaign slogans." The corners of her mouth twitched slightly, not quite a smile. "I'll speak to the facts, Judge. That's the only language I speak." From the back row, a young staffer snorted quietly. Jasmine didn't break eye contact with the judge. The court stenographer blinked, then began typing. Trenga flipped through a thick folder in front of him, glancing up only briefly. "You've made statements suggesting the federal investigation was riddled with prosecutorial bias. What legal basis do you have to make such a claim?" There it was, the bait. A loaded question with 1,000 ways to look arrogant, unprepared, or defensive. But Jasmine didn't blink. "The prosecutorial discretion doctrine gives U.S. attorneys broad latitude," she said calmly. "But when that discretion begins to resemble selective enforcement, particularly when similar cases are handled differently based on political affiliation, that's not just bias, Judge. It's an equal protection concern." He leaned back slowly in his chair. A long pause followed. "Big words for someone who's been in Congress for, 14 months? Another chuckle from somewhere in the back. Jasmine heard it. She just didn't care. "I practiced law for over a decade before this seat," she said, her voice even. "If you'd like to check my record on wrongful convictions or federal appeal reversals, I'm happy to forward it." A couple of heads turned. That wasn't the kind of answer Trenga expected, but he still had cards to play. He leaned forward, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. His tone dropped, cooler now. "Well then, perhaps you'd like to explain your understanding of prosecutorial overreach in the context of United States v. Armstrong, since that case defines the threshold you just referenced." A few people in the room straightened in their chairs. It was a sharp pivot, legal, specific, and meant to corner her. Jasmine, however, didn't flinch. "In Armstrong, the defense failed to provide evidence of discriminatory intent, which is why the Supreme Court ruled against them," she replied. "But it also set a narrow path forward for proving selective prosecution under equal protection, something I believe the committee has overlooked in the current case. The failure isn't in citing Armstrong, Judge. The failure is in misunderstanding its implications." And just like that, the room shifted slightly. Trenga narrowed his eyes, not in anger, in calculation, because what had started as a warning shot had just landed somewhere between challenge and surprise. But the tension hadn't peaked yet. He still had more to throw at her, and she knew it. Judge Trenga didn't like being corrected, especially not in public, especially not by someone half his age and twice as composed. He stared at Jasmine for a second too long, as if deciding whether to press harder or recalibrate. He chose harder. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, his voice tightening, "you seem quite eager to assert legal authority, but I don't recall any amicus brief from you in this matter, nor any formal opinion tied to judicial review. So I'll ask again. What qualifies you to sit here and imply federal impropriety?" Jasmine sat still for a beat. The easy thing to do would have been to defend herself, run through her degrees, her court cases, her legislative record, but that's not how you keep control in a courtroom. You don't defend your right to speak. You demonstrate why you were asked in the first place. She leaned forward slightly. "With respect, Judge, I wasn't called here to recite my resume," she said, "but since you brought it up, Yes, I've filed amicus briefs. Yes, I've challenged Department of Justice decisions in federal court, and I've also defended clients who were steamrolled by prosecutors who assumed no one would push back. That's what qualifies me. The room quieted again. A woman near the left wall, possibly press, scribbled something in a small notebook. Trenga adjusted his glasses. So your argument, he said slowly, is that the prosecutors acted with malicious intent? That's a strong claim, Congresswoman. Reckless, even. No, she replied. My argument is that when patterns of enforcement consistently tilt in one direction against people who look a certain way, vote a certain way, or speak too loudly, it stops being coincidence. It starts being selective. And selective prosecution is unconstitutional. The judge blinked once. He flipped a page in his folder. You're aware this committee doesn't have the authority to overturn prosecutorial discretion, correct? I am. I'm also aware that we have the authority to investigate patterns of abuse and bring them to light. Jasmine replied, her voice steady. You asked why I'm here. That's why. For the first time, a flicker of something passed across Trenga's face. He didn't smile, but his tone softened, just a hair. Let's move on. He turned to a different document, but Jasmine could tell he was off balance. Not by anything she said directly, but because she didn't play the game the way he expected. Most witnesses, especially those with political ties, came in either rehearsed or rattled. Jasmine was neither. She was calm, and worse, for him, she was prepared. But the judge wasn't finished. He motioned toward a chart projected on the screen behind him, one showing conviction rates in different districts. You referenced patterned enforcement earlier, he said. Based on these numbers, which district do you claim is violating equal protection? Jasmine looked up at the chart briefly, then down at the table. That chart is incomplete, she said. It doesn't show prosecutorial declinations, plea bargaining disparities, or pretrial detention inconsistencies. Without that, it tells a half story. So you're saying the data is flawed? I'm saying the story behind the data is more complicated than you're presenting it. And if you want to talk about systemic bias, you can't cherry-pick conviction rates. You have to include every point of contact between a defendant and the state. He stared at her again, longer this time. The corners of his mouth pressed into a firm line. That's not how this hearing is structured, Congresswoman. Maybe that's the problem. The words weren't loud. She didn't raise her voice, but somehow they landed hard. The judge let silence linger as if he hoped she might backtrack or clarify. She didn't. She let the silence sit with him. Let the weight of her words do the work. He cleared his throat and looked back down at his notes. From across the room, someone whispered, "She's holding her own." Another voice replied, "No, she's holding court." But Trenga still had one more tactic up his sleeve, and this time he planned to corner her where she'd least expect it. The judge adjusted in his seat, flipping slowly to the last section of his folder. Something about the way he moved, methodical, too calm, told Jasmine this next part was designed to catch her off guard. Let's talk about your comments on prosecutorial ethics, he said. You accused certain offices of neglecting Brady obligations. That's a serious charge. Can you cite specific instances where exculpatory evidence was withheld? A trap, plain as day. If she named cases, she'd be accused of interfering. If she refused, they'd paint her as vague and inflammatory. But Jasmine had been here before, in depositions, in trial, in private arbitration rooms where lives were on the line and rules got blurred. So she leaned back just slightly, enough to signal that she wasn't rattled, not even close. I'm not accusing individual prosecutors by name, she said. I'm pointing out that systemic practices, like underreporting Brady material or using coercive plea deals, don't always leave a paper trail. But the patterns speak for themselves. And what patterns are those exactly? Trenga asked, voice cool. She took a breath. This was the moment that mattered, the pivot point between sounding like an angry official or a lawyer with facts on her side. In Travis County, Texas, 17% of exonerations over the last 10 years involve Brady violations. In Prince George's County, Maryland, the state's attorney's office has been sued multiple times for failure to disclose exculpatory evidence. These aren't isolated incidents, Judge. They're symptoms of a deeper issue. He didn't respond right away. He just stared, like he was trying to figure out where this confidence was coming from, like he was looking for a crack in her tone. But Jasmine wasn't just reciting facts. She was telling stories behind them. I had a client, she continued, a teenager who was picked up for a robbery he didn't commit. The police had surveillance footage from a nearby gas station, time-stamped, showing he was miles away when it happened. That footage sat in a box for 8 months. Nobody ever submitted it to defense. I only found it because a clerk made a filing error and we stumbled across the wrong file. That kid sat in jail for almost a year waiting on trial. Trenga shifted in his chair again, his fingers now still. You believe that was intentional? I believe it was convenient, she replied, and I believe convenience has a way of becoming policy when nobody's watching. The room didn't make a sound, not even the reporters, not the committee chair, not the staffers, just the faint tapping of the court stenographer's keys. That's a moving anecdote, Congresswoman, Trenga said finally, but anecdotes aren't evidence. No, she said, but they're warnings, and if we keep ignoring the warnings, the damage doesn't stay anecdotal, it becomes systemic. There it was, no fire, no yelling, just steady, deliberate pressure, and it was working. The judge didn't reply immediately. For the first time since she walked into that courtroom, his expression was unreadable. She kept going. When judges overlook misconduct because the conviction rate looks good on paper, they're complicit, she said. When DAs treat courtrooms like assembly lines, justice becomes optional. And when defense attorneys are forced to play detective just to get a fair trial, that's not a system. That's a trap. A few heads nodded this time. Trenga noticed. He wasn't used to losing control of the room, and certainly not from someone who was supposed to be the target. He tried one last redirect. So you believe this committee should initiate a formal review of DOJ policy based on isolated claims? No, Jasmine said, meeting his eyes again. I believe the DOJ should be accountable like any other institution. If a cop plants evidence, we hold them responsible. If a judge shows bias, we call it out. Prosecutors shouldn't be immune because their mistakes wear a suit and carry a badge. This time, the silence was different, not tense, not dismissive, just listening. Trenga tapped his pen once on the desk. A soft click. He didn't smile, but he didn't challenge her either. But he wasn't finished yet, and Jasmine could feel it. The real test was coming, and he would aim where it hurt. Judge Trenga stayed quiet for longer than usual this time. His eyes scanned the notes in front of him, but something had shifted. He wasn't reading to prepare his next jab. He was buying time. Then he found it. A printed document with 2 clipped corners. He held it up slowly. Congresswoman, he began, before your congressional tenure, you represented a client named Devin Rayford in a civil rights case against the Dallas County Sheriff's Department. Is that correct? Jasmine's posture stayed still, but her fingers curled slightly against the table's edge. Yes, she said. That case was dismissed without prejudice after a key witness recanted under pressure. Under pressure, Trenga echoed. You argued that the recantation was coerced by investigators, yet failed to present direct proof. Isn't that also a convenient narrative? Jasmine's jaw clenched, just barely. That case had stuck with her, not because they lost, but because of how they lost. She knew what Trenga was doing. He was trying to shake her, make her doubt her own track record, pull a ghost from the past and parade it as her weakness. But ghosts don't scare people who've already buried them. She took a slow breath. Devin was arrested without a warrant, held for 48 hours without access to counsel, and then beaten in a holding cell. The department's internal footage malfunctioned that same night. A month later, our witness changed his story and then moved out of state. So you based your entire case on one shaky witness? Trenga asked. No, she said calmly. We based it on hospital records, booking logs, time-stamped phone calls, and a missing 2-hour gap in surveillance footage that no one at the department could explain. She leaned forward, her voice steady as stone. But since you brought up that case, I'll ask you something, Judge. When's the last time you sat across from a mother whose son came out of holding with 6 broken ribs and no explanation? When's the last time you had to tell her that unless someone confesses or a camera catches it, her son won't get justice? Trenga said nothing. You can dig through my record all you want, she continued. I've lost cases. I've been outmaneuvered, but I've never backed down from telling the truth, even when the courtroom didn't want to hear it. Her words cut through the room like glass underfoot. Trenga pressed his lips together. That's not the issue at hand, Congresswoman. No, Jasmine said. It's the issue you brought up to discredit me. And suddenly, the balance shifted. He didn't interrupt her anymore. He didn't smirk or throw another obscure case at her. Instead, he shuffled the papers in front of him, almost trying to regain footing. But Jasmine didn't give him the space. You came in expecting me to fumble, she said, to shrink, to stumble through this hearing like I hadn't done this before. But I have. She looked out at the committee. I've stood in front of biased judges. I've cross-examined hostile witnesses. I've watched defendants get thrown into holding without due process. And I've fought tooth and nail for the Constitution to mean the same thing for everyone. Now her voice rose, not in volume, but in presence. I know what this room was supposed to be today, but I didn't come here to play defense. I came to remind this institution and everyone watching that accountability works both ways. Trenga's silence now wasn't tactical. It was reactive. Even some of the other committee members sat a little straighter. He glanced at the chairperson, who nodded subtly, signaling the next segment. But Jasmine had already done what he didn't expect. She turned the pressure around, without raising her voice, without grandstanding, just facts, stories, logic, human truth. Trenga cleared his throat. No further questions at this time. But while the judge had stepped back, the room itself hadn't exhaled. Something was still building, and Jasmine wasn't finished yet. The room didn't feel like a courtroom anymore. It felt like a chessboard where the quietest player just took the queen. Judge Trenga sat still, but his hands betrayed him, fingertips tapping out a rhythm he hadn't planned. The committee chair, Representative Lionel Voss from New Mexico, gave Jasmine a quick glance. Not approval, not warning, just acknowledgement. She'd earned the floor now. A younger congressman, Emory Banks from Oregon, leaned into his microphone. Congresswoman Crockett, would you care to expand on what you mean by accountability working both ways? Trenga opened his mouth, maybe to object, maybe to reclaim structure. But it wasn't his time anymore. Jasmine gave a small nod toward Banks, but her eyes drifted back to Trenga. She wanted him to hear this next part. Yes, she said. For too long, accountability has been one-directional. Prosecutors investigate, courts evaluate, defendants answer. But when a prosecutor overreaches, when a judge shows bias, the system slows down, the spotlight dims. She paused to let it land, then leaned in, a little closer to the mic. If we want faith in the justice system, it can't just be about convictions. It has to be about truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable. The press section was scribbling now, fingers flying, but the real attention was in the silence from the other committee members. Nobody cut her off. Nobody moved. So she kept going. There was a case in Phoenix, she said. A 16-year-old arrested for armed robbery. Except the ATM footage showed he was nowhere near the scene. That evidence sat in a folder for weeks while they pressured him to confess. They called it a paperwork delay. I call it a near miss on a ruined life. Trenga spoke again, but slower this time. That case didn't fall under this committee's jurisdiction. No, Jasmine replied, but it falls under the jurisdiction of conscience. His eyes narrowed, but he didn't interrupt again. Across the room, someone coughed quietly. The energy had shifted. There was no more sparring, just listening. Trenga leaned forward, resting both hands on the desk. He was no longer trying to win. He was trying to understand how he lost control of the narrative. You speak with strong conviction, Congresswoman, he said, but this hearing was convened to evaluate institutional procedure, not individual heartbreaks. Heartbreaks are what happen when institutions fail, she said. Procedure doesn't live in a vacuum. It lives in real lives, real decisions, and real silence when things go wrong. Another long pause. Then Jasmine turned to the full committee. Every time we defend bad behavior because it came from a powerful office, we weaken the foundation we claim to protect. It's not radical to expect fairness. It's radical that we still have to ask for it. One of the older committee members, Georgia's Louisa Fenn, looked up from her notes. What would fairness look like to you, Congresswoman? Jasmine didn't hesitate. Transparency, independent oversight, and the courage to admit that no institution, no judge, no DA, no courtroom is above scrutiny. Trenga folded his hands. The silence stretched between them like a tightrope. I've served on this bench for over 25 years, he said finally. I've seen all kinds of witnesses, politicians, activists. lawyers. But I'll admit, few of them speak as you just did. Jasmine didn't blink. I didn't come here to be liked, she said. I came here because too many people can't speak for themselves in rooms like this. There was nothing left to challenge, nothing left to prove. The power had shifted without a single outburst, a single insult, or even a single raised voice. Just a woman who knew the law and reminded everyone else what it was supposed to protect. But Jasmine had one last message to deliver, and she wouldn't leave that courtroom until it was heard. The hearing was supposed to be winding down, but nobody moved, not even the bailiff. It was as if the courtroom itself had paused to hear what Jasmine might say next. She adjusted her mic once more. There was no script in front of her, no binder of notes, just her voice and years of experience that had taught her when to hold, when to hit, and when to speak for those who never made it to court at all. I'm aware this hearing won't change everything, she said, her voice calm but firm. But if we sit here pretending our justice system works equally for everyone, we're lying to ourselves. Her eyes moved across the panel. Some looked down, some didn't blink. When someone is wrongfully convicted, we don't just lose one life. We lose trust in the law. And when that trust breaks, people stop believing that truth matters. She paused. And when people stop believing truth matters, corruption becomes quiet, comfortable, common. Judge Trenga sat back, arms folded now. No tapping, no fidgeting, just watching. His face was unreadable, but his silence spoke volumes. Jasmine turned slightly, facing the public gallery. I once defended a woman named Aline Whitlow, she said, single mother, accused of mail fraud for cashing a check that wasn't hers. The check came from a payday lender that had misprinted a name. She turned it in, thinking it was a refund check. She ended up in federal court, labeled a thief. Her voice softened. The DA offered her a plea deal, 18 months probation. She wanted to fight, said she didn't steal anything, but the risks were too high. If she lost, she'd go to prison. So she took the deal, kept a felony on her record, lost her job, never got another one that paid more than $11 an hour. Jasmine looked back at the judge. She wasn't dangerous. She wasn't dishonest. She was just poor, and the system crushed her for it. That silence again, the heavy kind. The kind that makes you wonder if you've been quiet too long or if someone finally heard what they weren't ready to admit. Trenga cleared his throat, but when he spoke, his voice lacked its earlier bite. You seem to believe our institutions are broken, Congresswoman. She gave a half shrug. I believe they're sick, and I believe they won't heal unless people inside them stop pretending the infection isn't there. For a few seconds, Trenga just stared at her. Then he did something no one expected. He nodded. Not big, not performative, just a small, reluctant gesture, like a man realizing that respect doesn't always look like agreement. Sometimes, it looks like listening when you didn't plan to. The committee chair tapped his mic. Congresswoman Crockett, thank you for your testimony today. You've given us much to consider. She stood slowly, collecting her notes. Blank pages, really, more for habit than use. Before she left, she turned once more toward the judge. I'm not here to win arguments, Judge Trenga. I'm here because I've seen what happens when people like me stay silent. I won't do that. Not here. Not anywhere. Then she walked out. No fanfare, no handshake, just a quiet exit through a courtroom that didn't look quite the same as it did an hour before. Outside, a reporter called after her. Do you think the judge underestimated you today? She paused, glanced over her shoulder. He underestimated the law. I just reminded him who it's supposed to serve. And with that, she kept walking. No one followed. Inside that room, no one doubted her anymore. And for once, the story that would be written wouldn't be about a clash. It would be about clarity. Because sometimes, the most powerful voice in the room isn't the loudest. It's the one that refuses to be dismissed. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories that remind us of the courage it takes to speak truth in rooms built to silence it. One voice can change everything. Yours might be next.